They weren't the roaring 20s, just the plain 1920s in the first years of that decade. America was still enchanted with the Edison talking machine in the parlor. The digital society we know now did not exist. No social security numbers, direct dialing, or 9-number zip codes. Refrigerator meant icebox. Stop signs were yellow, milk bottles thick and heavy. The party line telephone was the best source for the latest news, and you had to hand crank your music on the Victrola. But all that was changing. Seemingly in no time at all after the decade began, the phonographs were packed off to attics and basements to make way for the new technical wonder, radio. Although radio had been around a while, it was, up to this point, largely the province of a few eccentric amateurs. But now the amateurs were fast evolving into businessmen. In 1922 alone, more than 500 stations rushed to the air. In that same year, RCA by itself sold more than $11 million worth of radio receivers, and in 2 years that figure would jump to more than $50 million. But success in radio was hardly a foregone conclusion. In the years that followed, hundreds of radio stations fell silent, and hundreds, if not thousands, of those early broadcasters went broke pursuing their dreams in radio. It was, and still is, survival of the fittest, the brightest, and the best. Tonight, we pause to salute two of those early broadcast pioneers, Don Searle and John Powell. These two men and others like them had the vision and took the risks to create the broadcasting industry in Nebraska. They paved the way for the rest of us to follow. The theme song from the television show WKRP in Cincinnati tells about radio broadcasters packing and unpacking, moving up and down the dial. Don Searle may have been one of the original radio gypsies. He crisscrossed the Midwest and Far West in his career, but always maintained his ties to Nebraska through ownership of KMMJ in Grand Island for more than 30 years, from 1936 to 1967. But that was nowhere near the beginning of his broadcasting career. It started in 1925 when the Searle family put KOIL on the air in Council Bluffs. 8 years later, the station was sold, and the then 34-year-old Don Searle set off for Topeka to become the general manager of the powerhouse Kansas radio station WIBW. Those were exciting days in early Kansas radio as the whole nation intently followed the nomination and ultimate defeat of the Kansas native son, Alf Landon, in his bid for the presidency. In 1937, Don was persuaded to return to Omaha and to call letters he knew very well, KOIL. This time, however, he served as the general manager for the Central States Group and was responsible for Lincoln stations KFAB and KFOR, as well as KOIL, now situated across the river in Omaha. During this Omaha tenure, Don also worked to advance the interest of all broadcasters as a director of the National Association of Broadcasters and as a member of the Code Committee. He was not above a little good-natured silliness either. In this 1940 newspaper photo, Searle and legendary ad man Morris Jacobs are identified as National Committeemen for the Gracie Allen for President campaign. Gracie's National Surprise Party Convention was part of the fun and civic effort to promote Omaha's Golden Spike Days. As it happened, the Searle family was not to send many holiday cards from Omaha like this one. In 1944, Don was tapped to be the general manager of KGO in San Francisco. The year before, KGO and the rest of the NBC Blue Network had been sold following an FCC order to end NBC's radio dominance. The new network, ABC, and its owner, lifesaver king Edward Noble, had a sharp eye for talent. Scarcely 2 years slipped by before Don transferred to Los Angeles and was promoted to vice president of ABC's Western Division and general manager of KECA. The call letters were changed in the same year that Don took over the helm, and KECA became the present-day KABC. A 1947 heart attack forced Don to give up his fast-rising career with ABC, but he wasn't about to give up broadcasting. Even while recuperating, he started a national radio show originating from Chicago. In 1948, he purchased KXXX Colby, Kansas. In 1957, he bought KIOA in Des Moines, and a few months later he added KFNF Shenandoah, Iowa to his list of stations. Don was tempted into television only one time. With a group of investors, which included comedian Bob Hope, he put KOA-TV in Denver on the air in 1953 and stayed on for a year as general manager before returning to Los Angeles. Eventually, Don sold his radio properties, but he was reluctant to let go of his Nebraska ties. KMMJ was the last station to be sold in 1967, and Searle moved from Grand Island to Monterey, California, where he lived until his death in 1971. Born in 1899, Don Searle witnessed the remarkable achievements of the 20th century, including the growth of the industry he loved so much, broadcasting. A graduate of the University of Iowa, Don served in the Air Corps during World War I. He served his country, his community, his industry, and his family. His daughter, Sally Clark, is an Omaha resident involved in farm management, and his son, Don Jr., continues the family broadcasting tradition. He is the director of research for KCOP in Los Angeles. Young broadcasters in the early days learned a lot about United States geography firsthand as new stations appeared and sometimes disappeared. If you liked the business, you had to be mobile. And if Don Searle was an original radio gypsy, then John Powell was part of the second generation. John retired from KHAS radio in July of last year. After 28 years of service to the Hastings community, his influence has had lasting effects. His listeners are left with a thriving station, a station willing to broadcast every play of Hastings College football and basketball, and one that's earned more than its share of Exarban Community Service Awards. His former employees and interns and recipients of a communications scholarship established by John were given the benefit of his experience. Some notables: Fred White, voice of the Kansas City Royals; Steve Fisiak, a television sports director and voice of the Cincinnati Reds; and Channel 13 newsman Bob Bowie, former KHAS program director. And John Powell was a good one to learn from. His career began when only 700 radio stations were on the air, and radio people thought of each other more like fraternity brothers than competitors. While Don Searle was juggling duties as head of 3 Nebraska stations, a young John Powell was graduated from high school in Enid, Oklahoma. FDR was in his second term. John's first radio job was with WCED, Du Bois, Pennsylvania. He went on to Kent State University, managed the college radio station, and was graduated cum laude. John went on air at WJW in Akron and then at KLMB in La Grande, Oregon. A new word that could have described John's career to this point suddenly meant war, blitzkrieg. Like so many others, John's plans were abruptly interrupted. He spent 4 years in the Air Force during World War II, serving with the Brazilian-American Military Commission in South America in 1945 and 46. He returned to KLMB, but a post-war boom kept John and new bride Rosemary on the move and on the rise. In Ontario, Oregon, he helped build AM KSRV from scratch. That included setting ground wires, finishing the building, and then hitting the streets. Hankering for the heartland, John headed for the Bluegrass in Lexington, Kentucky at WLEX. This was followed by management assignments closer to the tall grass of St. Joe, Missouri, KRES, Hutchinson, Kansas, KWBW, and Mason City, Iowa, KSMN, all preparation for what he calls home, Hastings and KHAS. In a nostalgic moment, John might fill you in on the excavation of a civil defense fallout shelter at KHAS in the early 60s. A staffer recently discovered an unopened tin of crackers, or tell you about some tense moments in 1980 when vandals toppled his tower. Of course, John was back on the air 12 hours later, broadcasting off a 70-foot tower stub. Through it all, a friend says, John Powell was always a person willing to take on a project for the many civic organizations he served. Well, he may have been the J.C. Boss of the Year in 1968, and even one of the core group who held together the Nebraska Broadcasters Association in the early years. But to 4 girls, he's just Dad. Roseanne, Colleen, and Kara are married and scattered to Lincoln, Columbia, Missouri, and Dallas. Ph.D. Joanne lives in Champaign, Illinois, and these 2 aspiring account executives are 6-year-old Kyle and 2-year-old Laura, John's grandchildren. In retirement, John is still troubleshooting for Nebraska stations. Don Searle and John Powell, 2 men who pioneered the way for all of us. As we honor them tonight with induction into the Nebraska Broadcasters Hall of Fame, at the same time we add new luster to this prestigious honor, for they are 2 of the best and the brightest in broadcasting.